I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. As hundreds of wildfires continue to burn across the country, major cities miles away from the activity are dealing with smoke blanketing their skies. Ottawa, Belleville, and Kingston, Ontario are posting some of the worst air pollution levels in the country. This is due to drifting smoke from forest fires. And with more than 200 forest fires burning in only Ontario and Quebec alone, Environment Canada is forecasting poor air quality will persist into the weekend. Special air quality statements remain in effect for major areas of both provinces. The wind has also carried smoke from the fires southward, triggering air quality alerts throughout the United States. Joining us now to give us more insight into the health impacts of wildfire smoke and how to stay safe is Dr. Joe Vipent, an emergency physician and past president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. Dr. Vipent, thank you again for your time today.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's important.
Definitely. Now, the impact from these raging wildfires can now be seen and felt in cities miles away, even in the U.S. So other than these cities we mentioned in southern Ontario, where else can we see air quality advisories in place in Canada?
Well, it seems to be a lot across the eastern areas of both Canada and the United States, which is different from what we're used to, right? Like the reason why this is a news story is because typically this is a Western phenomenon: Vancouver, Calgary, Oregon, California, and yet this time it's impacting the very heavily populated East, and so I think that's why everybody's eyes are on that area.
Definitely. And what actually triggers an air quality alert in the first place? How do officials measure air quality?
Well, my understanding is that they're really looking at these really tiny particles called PM 2.5. And these are the very, very small particles that float through the air. We know they have immense health impacts. So we know this mostly from like coal combustion studies where, coal and other combustion of fossil fuels, they've looked at the air pollution impacts on humans. And these particles are so fine that they actually get in through the lungs, through the small tubes in the lungs into the blood vessels, and that's why they're so dangerous. Is because they can have health impacts throughout the entire body. They cause things like strokes. They cause things like heart attacks. Of course, the thing that we most think about is the irritation of our lungs, making us cough, making us feel bad. But there are serious health impacts as well.
Some very concerning health impacts indeed. Now, what are the demographics that may be most at risk in terms of exposure to these tiny particles?
Those people who have pre-existing health conditions, asthma, COPD, of course, have the pulmonary impacts. And then the smallest kid of people, children, have impacts because they breathe quite a bit faster and inhale more into their lungs than most adults. So they also play outside, right? So they have a higher exposure rate. And then, of course, those people who are in the older demographics as well, because they're just more vulnerable physiologically to these kind of impacts.
So what are some of the safety measures that can be taken to protect yourself from this drifting wildfire smoke if you have to go outside? Because we're hearing advice to avoid going outside during air quality alerts. But if you have to go outside, what are some safety measures people should take?
Well, there's only one thing you can do if you're going outside, and that's wear a really good quality mask. And so that only thing that describes that is a respirator mask. These are the same masks that are most useful when it comes to protecting yourself from COVID. They're the ones that fit very tightly to your face, and they will be adequate to filter out the vast majority of those small, fine particles and keep them from getting into your lungs and hence into your bloodstream. Now, when you're indoors, there are also things you can do to keep yourself safe indoors. And one thing would be to replace your filter in your furnace with a high quality MERV 11, preferably MERV 13 filter or higher. That's what you can get from your local hardware store. Run your filter constantly. So the fan on your furnace constantly, not having it heat or cool, just having that air constantly recirculate through that filter will help. And if there are certain areas of your house that aren't getting adequate circulation, you can put in these portable HEPA filters. That's these particulate filters that you can buy at your local hardware store as well. And that can clear a room quite well. And those are a little bit on the expensive side. You can make those yourselves by Googling Corsi Rosenthal box, CORSI box, and you'll be able to see some materials you can use with furnace filters and a box fan, something you can put together for about $100 in about 30 minutes.
Some very helpful advice there, Dr. Vipin. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, up next, a conversation about the biggest challenges facing healthcare in Canada with Dr. Alika Lafontaine, president of the Canadian Medical Association. The Canadian Medical Association and 14 doctors and nurses organizations want healthcare to be the top of the agenda at next month's Premier's meeting. All provinces except for Quebec have agreed in principle to a plan announced in February, which will see Ottawa provide $196 billion to the Canada Health Transfer over the next 10 years. The CMA and other groups say that's a positive step, but they point out that the healthcare system is still struggling to deal with excessive wait times, a lack of primary care, a shortage of workers, and overcrowded emergency rooms. Well, joining us now to talk more on these issues is Dr. Alika Lafontaine, president of the Canadian Medical Association. Dr. Lafontaine, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me back.
So what is the current state of Canada's healthcare system after 3 years of battling the COVID-19 pandemic amid capacity issues, a shortage of workers, and so much more? Where are we at right now, Dr. Lafontaine?
So I think we're probably in a worse state, actually, than we were 3 years ago. For a lot of folks, we've started to get used to the reality that we're seeing rolling shortages of healthcare workers across the country. We're often having certain health services shut down. Last summer, we saw ERs shutting down across the country, including those in small towns where that was their only access. I think we'll see the same thing happening, and it'll continue to happen until we have action that affects the front line. And that's still a few months away.
An unfortunate trajectory here. Now, in terms of solutions, we mentioned that the federal government plans to invest $196 billion over 10 years to the Canada Health Transfer. However, you say money alone is not going to fix these problems. However, spending the money right might. So what does spending the money right look like?
Well, I think it really deals with two major issues. The first is the number one issue of patients, which is how do you improve access to care? And so whatever solutions get put in place, we have to make sure that we center them around people's ability to actually access services and the right types of services that they need. For healthcare providers, the number one issue is actually healthy working environments. I think we talk a lot about burnout and people's resiliency being low after years of the pandemic and increased stress. The reality is it's just not a great place to work in healthcare right now. And if we focus on access and healthy working environments, I think we do really have a chance of turning the tide with where this is going.
And in what ways is this upcoming Premier's meeting an opportunity to address these issues, particularly this major doctor shortage we're seeing across the country, and as you said, access to ERs in rural and small communities?
I think we can learn a lot from the past as we move to the future. If you look at the second largest investment in healthcare by the federal government, this was the largest this year. That investment spurred collaboration and coordination across different provinces and territories. We ended up getting the Wait Time Alliance out of that. With that Wait Time Alliance, people started to look at things like clinical pathways. And I think for a period of time between, the late 2000s and, 2012, people actually felt like things were getting better. I worked in the operating room as an anesthesiologist. I could actually see patients were getting easier access to care. What happened after that, and I think the reason why we're here today, everyone got up from the table and started doing things themselves again. And so I think any time that the premiers get together, it's really important to make sure that healthcare remains a focus. This is not going to be a problem that's going to go away if we just cover our eyes and quit paying attention to it. We're going to have to sit at the table and focus on some really difficult conversations moving forward.
All right, Doctor. Now, meanwhile, as we look towards what's discussed in this meeting, what are some of the next steps for the CMA and Canada's health system as a whole in terms of keeping things going forward, moving forward? Are there any strategies and plans in place right now by healthcare organizations?
So I think there is things that we'd like to see continue to scale. We had some breakthroughs this year related to regional and national licensure. Recognition of credentialing of healthcare providers has really shifted across the country. Places like Ontario and BC and elsewhere, we had the opening of the Atlantic Registry for physicians. So physicians in Atlantic Canada can move between those four provinces freely when providing locum coverage where there's shortages and there's high need. Leaning into things like team-based care. We've had a data framework that's come out with the Canada Health transfer payments. All of these things are things we need to lean into. But once again, these are complex problems that will not be solved unless we all remain sitting around the table focused. And that's our message to the premiers.
More work needs to be done. A quick 45 seconds left here, Doctor. Now, it seems that wait times and shortages are a new normal for patients using the public healthcare system. What sort of advice can you give to Canadians when it comes to dealing with all of this?
The piece of advice I'd have is that you need to shift where you're focused on receiving care in hopefully places that are less overwhelmed. So instead of going straight to the emergency room, try and get in contact with community primary care, walk-in clinics, virtual care. One of those is hopefully not overwhelmed. That's your best chance of getting care in a reasonable and timely manner. But hopefully we can fix these problems in the months and years coming ahead.
Hopefully. All right, Dr. Alika Lafontaine, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
After the break, a look at Equifax Canada's Q1 Consumer Credit Report. Our conversation with Rebecca Oakes from Equifax up next. Equifax Canada says credit demand was high in the first quarter of the year. The agency's latest consumer credit report finds that consumers are spending 21.5% more on average each month on their credit cards compared with pre-pandemic levels. It says the higher cost of living and the influx of new credit customers have made credit card balances rise by 14.5% year over year. Equifax says the first quarter normally brings a drop in non-mortgage debt as consumer spending slows after the holidays. But this year, credit card balances continued to rise. Well, joining us now to discuss the agency's consumer credit report for the first quarter is Ms. Rebecca Oakes, Vice President of Advanced Analytics with Equifax Canada. Ms. Oakes, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So from the sounds of it, consumers are spending more of what they don't have. Credit card debt is at an all-time high, $100 billion. And according to your report, there was a 19% rise in missed payments. Is this all purely because of the rising cost of living?
I mean, it's definitely a significant driver behind some of the movements that we're seeing. I mean, inflation levels are high. That links directly to spending because things just cost more in general. If you go to buy a new washing machine, it's going to cost more than it did a year or two ago. But however, that jump in spend isn't just what we're seeing. We're also seeing, as you mentioned, the credit active population increasing. Some of that's due to immigration, and some of that is just more consumers needing credit for their day-to-day lives. In Q1, we saw around 1 million more extra people becoming credit active compared to a year ago. So there's quite, a significant movement happening right now.
And is this increase consistent across all age demographics, or are some age cohorts maybe driving this increase?
Well, I mean, when we look at credit card balance in particular, that's definitely been higher for younger consumers and millennials than we've seen for some of the older population. We're also seeing a general overall average non-mortgage debts for those groups as well rising. I think it's worth bearing in mind that millennials in particular, where we're seeing some of that increase, this is kind of the most credit active period of their lives. Just naturally that age group tends to be more active. So some of it is just going to be linked to kind of the natural development of what you kind of do over your life.
Now, what's interesting is that Ontario and British Columbia were found to be the provinces with the highest non-mortgage delinquency rates. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, those two have definitely seen the biggest increase year on year. We do know that those provinces had some of the hottest housing markets, and they have seen increases in things like rental costs as well. So there is going to be more of an impact in terms of cost of living, and that might be pushing more people into financial difficulties. When we look at it at a product level, those provinces are also seeing kind of the averages increase more than the rest of Canada. So yeah, it's definitely something that's probably linked again to kind of those housing markets and this higher cost of living.
So what is the significance of this increase in credit card spending, specifically in the post-pandemic period? What does it say about the state of our economy?
Well, firstly, I would say that, increasing spend isn't necessarily a bad thing if payments are being maintained as well. And the good news is that payments are still much higher than we saw pre-pandemic. The less good news is that the overall rate of payment that has been reducing. So that's why we're seeing those credit card balances start to increase. Now, when you look at some of the economy-related numbers, we do believe there are pockets of financial stress where consumers are probably relying on credit a little bit more right now. and they may be getting into difficult water, but there is still a large chunk of that population that are spending and paying off their credit card as well. So for most, things are probably still manageable despite the high cost of living, but there are groups where there is some difficulties.
So, are there any solutions that Equifax may be proposing for Canadians, for officials to potentially reduce delinquency rates?
It's a difficult one. We know interest rates are high right now, and that obviously is having a knock-on impact to lots of things. It's not a simple answer to just reduce interest rates, because that unfortunately is going to add fuel to the fire when it comes to inflation. I think it's just a matter of time. We have to see how the current interest rates play out, and hope that spending reduces, inflation starts to come down, and things become a little bit more manageable for consumers.
We'll have to see for sure. Now, maybe looking towards the near future, what are Equifax's predictions for the coming months? Are we to expect maybe further financial strain on Canadians? Any relief in sight?
I think, unfortunately, the answer to that's going to be yes. We don't expect a shock in terms of a huge jump in delinquency levels or anything like that. We expect it to be much more gradual. We're starting to see more consumers with mortgages missing payments as well, likely linked to payment shocks from renewals. So, we think that will continue towards the end of the year. So we expect a gradual increase in missed payments rather than a kind of a big shock factor.
All right, Ms. Oakes, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Up next, a deeper look at the state of Canada's raging wildfire season with forestry expert Dr. Kelsey Copes-Gerbitz. So stay tuned. Forum Daily Week in Review will be right back after the break. Raging wildfires continue to burn across the country as some Canadians are forced to evacuate their homes and flee for safety. There are about 150 fires burning in Quebec alone, and the largest wildfire in Nova Scotia is still burning out of control in Shelburne County. Alberta recently ended a province-wide state of emergency, but officials warn that the situation remains serious. Well, joining us now to give us the latest updates on the wildfire situation in Canada is Dr. Kelsey Copes-Gerbitz, a forestry expert with expertise in wildfire resilience. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we know the Prime Minister made an announcement today on Canada's wildfires. Did we learn anything new from this announcement, especially in terms of tackling these wildfires?
I think the thing that really stood out for me from that address was the reality that wildfire risk is not going to get any better this season. We are looking at continued hot and dry weather that's going to make fighting fires really challenging.
Some unfortunate news, unfortunately, but wildfire season is common in Canada. So why do you think this year's fires, their frequency, their severity, are so unprecedented? Is it purely because of climate change, Doctor?
That's a really important question. And certainly climate change has a lot to do with the kind of fire behavior that we're seeing. Fires have always existed in Canada, and so that's a really important thing to remember. But what we're seeing is that climate change is causing the wildfire season to become longer, so it's starting earlier and ending later. And it's also causing more extreme fire behavior, which means sometimes it's actually unsafe to put firefighters on the front lines fighting these fires.
Now, meanwhile, as you say, experts are warning of more wildfires to come in the future. Can you give us some perspective on what our new normal could potentially look like during wildfire seasons in the near future?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we're living in that new normal now. We're seeing places burn that we aren't used to seeing burn. We're seeing wildfire states of emergency. We're seeing the need to bring in resources from other parts of across the country and from other countries as well. And so this really is our new normal, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, indeed. Now, how can officials prepare for potentially worse wildfires in the future?
I think we really need to have a big emphasis on being proactive about wildfire management. So that's all of the things that we can do before a wildfire ever starts. We have many months of the year when wildfires are maybe not at the top of our mind. And those are the months where it's most important to be gathering resources, to be getting communities prepared for the likelihood of an evacuation.
And on the note of communities, we know that your research looks at Indigenous land stewardship and communities that develop their own strategies to address the impact of wildfires. Can you tell us a little bit more about these strategies and how these communities deal with wildfires, and if there's something we could learn from here?
Yeah, these place-based and community-led initiatives are really important because they're They're supporting the ability of communities to have involvement in wildfire management around their communities. They know what they value, they know who's at risk within their communities. And so some of the lessons that we're seeing, the leadership that we're seeing from First Nations across Canada and particularly within BC and the community forests here in BC, they're really demonstrating the ways that communities can be proactively involved and play important leadership roles in this space.
And what does that look like, Doctor?
It looks like communities being prepared for the eventuality that a wildfire is going to occur. It means following fire smart principles. It means preparing your home and your community should an evacuation have to occur. And it means dealing with the kind of wildland areas that might be adjacent to a community to reduce the risk of fire moving into those areas and potentially moving into communities.
All right, and just bringing this back home to our viewers, what sort of role do individual Canadians play in mitigating and preparing for the wildfire seasons?
Individuals have a huge role to play. It's important to recognize that now is the time to learn how to coexist with wildfires, which means being ready for them to occur because they will occur, even in places that maybe are a little bit unexpected. So individuals have a responsibility to look at their homes, support their communities, get in touch with a local Fire Smart coordinator. And if you don't have one, maybe you could step up and be that person for your community.
All right, Dr. Copes-Gerbitz, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media for updates. You can also watch all of our news and commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks again for joining us today on Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time. Have a great weekend, Canada. Take care.